us. This is another live broadcast of the Never Again Live podcast series with our host, as always, Meir HaLevi Weinstein, who's the former founder and director of Israel Now and the former national director of the Jewish Defense League Canada. And we have Meir Jalowitz, who's always a pleasure to have with us because he's so calm and relaxed and never dogmatic or opinionated. And he'll be with us momentarily as well. Tonight's show, we're going to cover the Oslo Accords 30 years later of this failed, treacherous, awful idea. And we're going to also talk about an article that Meir Jalowitz just published, which you all need to get the link to, which we'll send later, which is Mass Blindness, Voluntary Self-Deception. And we're also going to talk about the failure of Jewish leadership. So without any further ado, I'm going to fade off into the distance. I am the not always very silent partner. So guys, if you need me for anything or any glitches, give me a holler. Otherwise, take it away, Meir.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Meir Weinstein. It's a pleasure to present this show to you. Very important tonight. It's 30 years since the Oslo Accords were signed by Israel and the PLO terrorist organization. After 30 years to the day, records are now declassified in Israel, and the public is able to understand what was going on with the Oslo Accords, who was objecting to it, the problems with it, the serious problems with it, the flaws with it. Interestingly enough, one of the loudest critics of it at the time was Baruch. And we'll talk about that in the show as well. But I remember when the Oslo Accords were being signed, that in Canada, members of the U.S. State Department were invited to make a presentation to the Canadian Jewish Congress and members of the Jewish community. Certain people from the Canadian Jewish community were invited to this meeting, and I was invited as well. And I remember the representative of the U.S. State Department telling leaders of the Jewish community, referring to Yasser Arafat as a tough negotiator. That already sent a red flag as far as I'm concerned. He was not anything like a tough negotiator at all. He did not recognize the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish state in any size, shape, or form. He was the father of terrorism against Israel, and thousands of Jews were murdered as a result of the Oslo Accords. The insanity of setting up a Palestine state in the heartland of Israel with the hills overlooking the major cities where Jews live in Israel is a recipe for suicide. Meir Jalowitz has written a recent article on this, on the absence of Jewish leadership, the willingness of Jewish masses to ignore reality. Meir, how are you this evening? Meir Jalowitz, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, okay.
I can.
Thank
Loud
you.
and clear.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yes.
I think there are two reasons why we're here. I had a piece published, which can be readily found in the op-ed section of israelnationalnews.com, also known as Arutz Sheva. There's a piece that appeared 2 days ago, and I put it together because of the, as you mentioned, the 30th anniversary of Oslo, but also because in the background of everything that we hear today is still this absolute maddening discussion about a two-state solution, or as I have on this broadcast and others often referred to as a two-state illusion or two-state delusion. What I did is I put together this piece, and it began with a quotation from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1975, and the title was taken from it. And if I might, if I may, let me just briefly to one sentence opening. In 1975, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a piece called Warning to the West. And in it, he had the following, and I quote, "Human nature is full of riddles and contradictions. Why is it that societies with access to every information suddenly plunge into lethargy, into a kind of mass blindness, a kind of voluntary self-deception?" And the title that the piece was given was "A Kind of Mass Blindness, a Kind of Voluntary Self-Deception." That actually described Oslo then, 30 years ago, and it describes no less, perhaps even more accurately, this foolish quest for a solution based on two states. I'm sorry, I can keep rolling if you want me to.
Oh, I thought you were, okay,
No.
okay. You know, Mayor, I was, at the time of the Oslo Accords, as much as I was against it, I was hoping to be wrong all the time. I was hoping that that my suspicions and what I understand about anti-Semitism and movements to deny the Jewish people the right to have a state, right to live. I was hoping that I would be wrong and that it would work. And we had nothing but a bloodbath. Buses blowing up, pizza parlors blowing up. And I remember from the government at the time, Rabin government at that time, and part of that coalition also had the Shas party, and apparently the Shas party pulled out of that coalition and was quickly replaced by Arab parties, who definitely voted for the Oslo. That was the makeup of that coalition. But the mantra that they were saying after every terrorist attack was victims for peace. If your body parts were spewed all over the place, you were a victim for peace.
Well, more specifically, they call them sacrifices for peace.
Sacrifices for peace, right.
Yeah.
Right. So go on, Mayor. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just to clarify, the Shas party, which abstained at first, wasn't sure was going to vote. When it pulled out, it was, I mean, just to clarify for the purposes of historic accuracy, they were replaced by the Arab parties, but not as part of the coalition. It was only when Ram joined the Bennett Lapid thing that they were actually part of the coalition. What they did is they supported the government from the outside.
From the outside, okay.
Right. There's something that needs to be said. I've said this before. I will say it again. I've been lecturing for 45 years. I'll be saying the same thing for the next 45 years when I lecture. The darkest day in Israel's history, Israel's modern day history, was September 13th, 1993. It's the day that on the White House lawn, Rose Garden, Clinton brought together Arafat, Rabin, and Shimon Peres, and they signed this Oslo Accord. And the reason that it's the darkest day, more so, for example, than the Israel's war of independence, when 6,000 Jews died, which is 1% of the Jewish population of Israel at the time, more so than 2,656 Jews who died in the Yom Kippur War. At that time, we knew who the enemy was, and we called the enemy by his name. It was the Arab, it was the Muslim, it was the Islamic world. On September 13th, 1993, what happened is our side, the good guys, reached out, Rabin offered a feeble hand for a handshake with Yasser Arafat, who was the largest mass murderer of Jews since Hitler. And we proclaimed Arafat a peace partner. We made Arafat kosher. And we have not been allowed to escape that mistake until today. Until today, the Western world, the United States, American Jewish organizations, the media, academia, leftist organizations, the whole lot are united by one thing, that they view the Palestinian Authority, which came into being actually in 1994 as a cosmetic makeover of the PLO. The PLO still is the voice of the Palestinian people. And to this day, we, having made them kosher, we are blamed for the lack of peace in the Middle East. Now, the piece that I put together, which talked about this psychosis that Jews are suffering, actually put together, connected three dots. The first one, the first piece that I mentioned, the first element, and I presented this as a premise, suggesting if the premise was accurate, reasonable minds, common sense would lead us to the proper conclusion. So the first premise established was a piece that was written in January of 1955 in Foreign Affairs by then Major General Moshe Dayan, still young Moshe Dayan. I think he was 40 years old at the time. He was Chief of General Staff in 1955, and he basically wrote a piece that Israel is now 7 years old, and Israel faces a problem where it has no frontier security, surrounded by Arab enemies, and he described in detail how close Arab guns were in every situation to Israel's population, its industrial infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So the first element was Moshe Dayan in 1955 saying that the world realized that Israel has no security. Arab guns are too close. That was the first element and I suggested, of course, and it's true, that is the same situation we'll find ourselves in if, in fact, we allow a two-state solution. The second element I brought up was the fact that there's talk today, euphoria, that we find in the Western world and in Israel, and it's very dangerous, about the fact that Israel might establish a peace, as they call it, which is the wrong nomenclature, a peace with Saudi Arabia. What isn't discussed, and I do mention it briefly, is that the condition that Saudi Arabia has imposed in order for it to sit down and discuss a peace with Israel, that was their term. The real term is a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. In order for that to happen, the Saudis have imposed certain preconditions on Israel, and those preconditions are for Israel to go back to the pre-1967 lines, the lines that Ahmed Eben referred to as the Auschwitz borders. People seem not to want to mention it because the truth can be very painful. So Saudi Arabia is basing its position, and the United States government has accepted that position on what the Saudis originally called in 2002 the Saudi Peace Initiative, which they call the Air Peace Initiative. So the second element is that those people who think that Saudi Arabia is all of a sudden going to make peace with Israel without the inclusion of a Palestinian solution are completely misleading themselves. They're delusional. The third item, the third element, the third premise was this whole definition of occupation. And this underscores everything that I've always lectured about. And it's something which our side simply refuses to publicize and caught up in its madness. That is the definition of occupation. Most people, friend and foe, those people who support Israel, and I'm talking about people in Congress, I'm talking about people in American Jewish organizations, in academia, in Europe, throughout the United States, the State Department, all the rabbis. These people, when speaking about occupation, refer to the post-June 4th, 1967 borders. So when they talk about the Arabs demanding that Israel withdraw to its pre-occupation territory, everybody thinks that they're talking about June 4th, 1967. And it's a terrible mistake, and we play into the hands of the Arabs. because the Arabs are quite clear about what occupation is for them. Occupation for them didn't start in 1967, 56 years ago. Occupation for them started in 1948, and they say as much. On July 15th of last year, Mahmoud Abbas stood shoulder to shoulder with Joe Biden, and he turned to Joe Biden and he said to Biden, you, meaning America, needs to help us correct the 74-year occupation of Palestinian lands. And one doesn't have to be a genius to understand that last year, when he spoke about a 74-year occupation, he was speaking about the occupation of Israel's creation, the Nakba, in 1948. The math is quite simple, and yet nobody wants to challenge it. Oh, and what we do is we allow him to get away with this, and we play their game. We allow them to define the narrative. Well, we allow them to define the language, which sets up the narrative and directs the debate. And it's a debate that we will always lose. What we need to do is be honest and bring to everyone's attention the fact that when the Arab, including Mahmoud Abbas, the peacemaker who replaced Arafat, the peacemaker, when they talk about from the river to the sea, all discussions need to come to an end. Israel needs to slam the door shut, and they don't. And they don't because American Jews and Canadian Jews and Jews in Israel on the left all pressure Israel to make concessions. The Western world has accepted a formula for peace in the Middle East, which is based on this. Israel gives, and the Arabs get. And we will always lose that war. And we're losing it now, by the way. We're losing it now. One last sentence. The war used to be called it was the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was more rightly called the Arab War against Israel. If you want to include Iran, it was the Muslim war against the Jews. But it was the Arab war against Israel. Today, no one, not even the Jewish diplomats themselves, and the Jewish spokesmen that come to the Western world to speak on behalf of Israel, they all refer to it as the Israel-Palestinian issue.
Right.
We've surrendered the language, we've surrendered the narrative, and we are losing the debate because all of a sudden Israel, the Goliath, is fighting the Palestinians. And we need to stop that nonsense right now. It's the Arab war against Israel. And if you want to look at what the Arabs say themselves, they tell us quite clearly. They require, as a first step, and I emphasize, as a first step, the return to the pre-67 borders, where Israel will become truncated, Israel will become vulnerable. The frontier security that Moshe Dayan spoke about in 1955 will be much more perilous for Israel now because the Arabs living on its border will have missiles and Iran will be there. We need to wake up, and if 30 years of Oslo has taught us something, and I don't fashion myself a pessimist, I do believe that I'm a realist. It's a war we're losing, and it's a war we will never win unless we change the narrative.
Right. The when the Oslo was happening, that was Benjamin Netanyahu running against the Labor Party, running against Shimon Peres. And Netanyahu's formula was, what did he call it? Reciprocity. And I think he was working on trying to cancel the Oslo Accords ever since, but he's faced tremendous opposition from the deep state. But no, absolutely. They have to be, it's got to be fully exposed, and our leadership has to get it, and they can't talk about ending occupation because that plays right into the hands of them. Because the Arab narrative is, as you stated, 1948 began the so-called occupation of what they call Palestine. And the land belongs to us, and that's it.
So what's the solution?
So, Meir, how do we convince our leadership
Well,
to shift gears.
Well, here, let me clarify something, if I may.
Yep.
In 1992, the election was actually between Rabin and Yitzhak Shamir. Bibi didn't come into power until 96. In 1992, what's remarkable was when Rabin was actually campaigning, he actually campaigned that he was further to the right. He was known affectionately by those who liked him as Mr. Security. And in 1992, he actually suggested that he was further to the right of Shamir. Shamir lost that election. Rabin wasn't the one who was in charge of foreign policy. He was behind his back, Yossi Balin, and that ilk ran off to Oslo, hence the name. They came back with a proposal, Abu Al, and presented it to Shimon Peres. It was basically a fait accompli. It went for a vote. Rabin was actually against it. Rabin said that there were some problems with it. And it went for a vote on August 30th, which was 2 weeks before the signing. And that's when Baruch was first given any information about it. And he was, of course, as you mentioned, he was quite troubled by it. There was a vote taken, I think it was 16-0, the two abstained, people who were troubled. And I want to read you something, if I may, and this is important. Here's a piece that was written in Commentary Magazine in March 1994. It was written by Eival Carmel. He was well known to us. He was in charge of military intelligence with Rabin, also with Shamir. He is he's a co-founder of Memory, who certainly knows anti-terrorism.
Right.
He wrote the following. I'll just give you one sentence. He wrote the following in March of 1994. Mind you, March of 1994 is only half a year after the signing of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. And it was right when the PLO, for cosmetic purposes, was becoming the PA. Here's what he wrote then, and I'm reading just piecemeal, just one important sentence. And I'm going to emphasize, because when he wrote this, he actually put his own italics to emphasize how absolutely ludicrous this was. Here's what he wrote. The Israelis, he's talking about the whole Oslo thing. The Israelis were there for one of the most momentous diplomatic moves in the history of our country. And then again, without having consulted a single military authority, a single intelligence officer, or a single expert of air affairs. It's mind-boggling. It's truly mind-boggling. He goes on to say that Rabin himself was troubled by it, and it was only later that Rabin, having been railroaded by Shimon Peres to go along with the Yossi Balin plan, that Rabin said that there were hundreds, his quote, hundreds of issues which were left untouched. And he was not, in fact, so much that he at that point said that he didn't want to be there for the signing on the White House lawn. And he was compelled to be there by Bill Clinton. Now, just to take a step back to show you the lack of common sense on the part of the Israelis. In Israel at the time, there was a battle going on in the primaries between Shimon Peres, who was considered certainly more of a dove, as opposed to Rabin, who was considered hawkish. And all our friends, the strong nationalists in Israel, those people who supported sovereignty extended beyond the 67 borders, those people who understood settlements were a good thing, our friends, our colleagues, when the choice was made as to who do we want to win the labor primary, we want Rabin or we want Shimon Peres, all our friends chose wrong. They wanted Rabin to win because they reasoned, well, Rabin is more hawkish. He's closer in his ideological proclivity than is Shimon Peres, and therefore, push comes to shove, we'd rather have Rabin in there. It was a terrible mistake. It is because Shimon Peres has never won an election in Israel. Was incapable. Rabbi Kahane didn't speak about it. He said this a man who could not win. The rabbi put in these terms. He said, when you look at Menachem Begin is loved by half the country and is hated by half the country. He said Shimon Peres is hated by all of the country. Well, Shimon Peres being in the sat and watched behind the scenes Oslo happen. It was the same way that Kissinger was the only one, Kissinger serving Nixon was the only one who could have brought some kind of rapprochement between the United States and Canada, that's a good one, between the United States and China, and all of a sudden there was a terrible mistake. Now I'm going to trouble you by asking you to listen to one more very long sentence. It was a piece I wrote it in 1976. I wrote it as part of my master's thesis, which was the comparative analysis of the Jewish underground movements of the 1930s and 40s to the Palestinian movements of the 60s and 70s. It was about terrorism. Because I wrote this in the 70s. And this is what I wrote then, and we saw a few years later exactly what happened, and it still happens today. This is what I wrote then. Arab design, however emphasized euphemistic slogans, remains named the liquidation of Israel. And not a single spectacular event. As a result of a long series of political reverses. Hence, that situation of but of that he's really dribbled the television conception way, and that's what happened. To speak peace, never his word. We know proliferation of over 100% of Arab strikes in Israel, and 1,700 Israelis murdered while this process. Made in my the that I wrote referenced was if you put these three pieces together.
Meir, there seems to be an audio problem now coming from your end. It's difficult to, I'm just wondering if perhaps log off and log back on, because it's cutting into the information that you're sharing.
Okay, I'll try that. Okay.
Okay.
This is so old, nobody cares. Doesn't matter.
Hi, everyone. Meir Jalwitz will be back with us very soon. He's logging off. He's logging back on, but apparently there's some kind of a glitch with the audio for him. So just be patient. This is a very serious issue. And it's relevant today because the idea of a two-state solution, we've seen it proven year after year that there is no leadership in the so-called Palestinian community that will accept Israel as a Jewish state in boundaries that will be determined. They don't recognize the right of the Jewish people to a Jewish state in any shape or size. They don't even recognize our history at all. It's all denial, and it is Holocaust denial, and it's glorification of terrorism and incitement for terrorism. That's the fruits of the Oslo Accords. Another point that should be made is that the PLO was formed in 1964, 3 years before the 67 war. And, if they were against, they at that time, before the 67 war, Jordan controlled what they referred to as the West Bank, what we referred to as Judea and Samaria. And they had no intention then of setting up a Palestine state of any form. Meir, I was just filling in our viewers that prior to the 67 war, PLO was formed in 1964, and they never formed. And the area referred to by them as the West Bank and referred to by us as Judea and Samaria, they never attempted to form any kind of a Palestine state or anything like that. Their goal was always the destruction of any type of Jewish state.
Okay. The point that needs to be made before I get back to the point that I was making, and I hope that I can be heard clearer on your end.
It's better now.
Okay. These people who speak about, including friends of Israel, who talk about the fact that peace can be gotten by going back to the pre-67 borders, there's a very simple question that one would ask, and it's one that you were referencing. The question is, if in fact occupation was the cause of all the problem, it's the core of the problem in the Middle East, the question that needs to be asked, and it's an answer that they can't or won't give, why wasn't there peace in 66? Why wasn't there peace in 53? Why wasn't there peace in 1949? And the answer is the Arabs don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Now, the 3 pieces that I mentioned earlier as a premise, I did, of course, draw a conclusion. I mentioned that Moshe Dayan was talking about frontier security of Israel being with indefensible lines. I talked about the fact that the Saudis represent this new normalization of relations, but the condition of their doing it are the same conditions that the Arab world has always demanded, which is that Israel withdraw and make itself more vulnerable. That's a precondition. And by the way, the Saudis have even added other things to it. It's something which John Kerry used to speak about. They talk not only about the freeing of terrorists, 14,000 terrorists in Israeli prison. They talk about also the
contiguous.
They're talking a contiguous Arab state, right? Gaza, and they talk about also Resolution 194, UN resolution, which talks about the Arabs, the refugee problem, that Arabs who've been living in Dearborn, Michigan for 3 generations can all of a sudden come back and take over. And the third point that I mentioned was, as you mentioned, that the Arabs recognize all of Israel to be occupied. The conclusion that I draw from this somewhat long piece is quite simple. It's quite simple. And that is that peace isn't improbable, it's impossible.
Right.
Based on the conditions placed by Israel's enemies. And Israel needs to stop pretending. Israel needs to close the door and tell the world, the Western world, America, don't bother to knock until you get the Arabs to recognize our right to exist. And by the way, that scares me. And the reason I'm frightened by it is because if there was a smart Arab out there, Sadat was one of them. People seem to forget that when Sadat showed up in Israel in late 1977, just a few months after Menachem Begin was elected on May 17, 1977, the conditions for his having peace with Israel was not only with the withdrawal from the Sinai, wasn't only the Abu Radet's oil fields, it was there would be a Palestinian entity to become a Palestinian state. Everything that the Arabs demand today was part of what Anwar Sadat himself. But Israel just wanted to hear an Arab say, no more war, peace. And that's all they want to hear, and Israel throws itself. Well, the Arabs are going to wake up one day, and they're going to be smarter than I read a quote, which is part of my thesis written in 1976, in which I talked about the fact that the Arabs are going to wake up and realize they cannot beat Israel militarily, and therefore they're going to try and do it through diplomacy, which they are doing. They certainly found favor in
Right,
AIPAC
right.
is pro-Israel. And yet AIPAC, let's put it in perspective, in essence, recognizes the need for a two-state solution. This is
Right.
insanity.
Right.
It's insanity. So we who share the opinion that I now espouse, we are a minority of a minority of a minority. And we need to
Right.
come to terms with that. But Meir, just allow me one more thing to put it in perspective. One more thing.
Yes.
I mentioned September 13, 1993 as the darkest day in Israel's history because of the signing of this agreement, this accord with Israel's archenemy, the murderers, who continued to murder in a manner which proliferated, actually. Here's a piece that's ignored. I'm going to read you, once again, it's a very short piece. It was an interview done on Jordanian television on September 13th, 93. This was done by Yasser Arafat. I'm going to read you what he said, and the question that needs to be asked is, why would an Israeli government ever allow itself to continue playing this game that the charlatan has played? This is what Arafat said on Jordanian television the day that he signed the Oslo Accord. He said, and mind you, he did this in 93. This is 16 or 17 years after I wrote that piece in my thesis, and he basically says exactly what I said 16 or 17 years before. This is what Arafat said. Since we cannot defeat Israel in war, we do so in stages. We take any and every territory that we can of Palestine and establish a sovereignty there. And we use it as a springboard to take more. When the time comes, we can get the Arab nations to join us for the final blow against Israel. That was 30 years ago. Has any Israeli diplomat at a gathering with anyone from the European Union or representing the State Department ever pulled this out and read this to the American State Department and asked them if they actually legitimately expect Israel to continue this absolute hoax, this charade, that peace with the Arabs is possible? And the answer is no, because Israelis don't want to be the naysayers. And we suffer the price, and our children are murdered every day. More so this month than 30 years ago.
Right. Do you think, is the pressure on Israel as a result of previous years, the American aid to Israel represented about 10% of the GDP in Israel, and today it represents maybe 0.5%, and Israel should be impervious to it, or what?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that?
I just about 2.5, 3 hours ago, I gave a speech. I do a weekly speech here. And I gave a speech and I mentioned, and I referenced exactly what you were talking about. In 1974, but especially 1975, when then new president Gerald Ford called for what was called a reassessment of American foreign policy in the Middle East, in which he was going to hold back the shipment of the Phantom IV fighters until Israel fell in line and allowed Kissinger to do his shuttle diplomacy, where Israel would be asked to make concessions. Mind you, this is only a year and a half after Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur. It was put on Israel. At the time, Israel's GDP, two sources, the one said 12.3 billion, and the other said it was 14 billion. Nonetheless, let's use that number. The amount of aid that Israel was getting from the United States then, which was a combination of economic and military assistance, was 2.2 billion. And so, yes, you're right, Meir, 2.2 billion out of the 12.3 billion GDP time is a significant measure of support that Israel was getting from the United States. And one could say that the United States perhaps has more leverage. Today, Israel gets $3.8 billion a year, part of a 10-year, $38 billion program, which initially allowed Israel to spend 26% of those dollars military wherever they wanted, but the rest had to be used in the United States. And that's changed now, where Israel now has to spend all of the money that is given by the United States in the United States to Lockheed, to Boeing, to support the American military-industrial complex. What's interesting is to call it aid is a misnomer.
Right.
It is an investment in Israel. What the United States is doing is investing $3.8 billion in Israel per year. But let me get to the punchline. It's the one that you were talking about. The punchline is Israel's GDP today, and again, depending upon which source, but it's about 537 billion. One source has it at 547 billion. But it's $547 billion. And if you factor the percentages you did of how much support Israel is getting from the United States, Israel should, in order to strengthen its position vis-a-vis the rest of the world in the United States, is tell the United States to go to hell. We don't need trade. We have enough of a military that we can defend ourselves, and God forbid, if push comes to shove, we have to use whatever means necessary, we will. Given the fact that we don't want to give Israel, sell Israel military equipment, the F-35, for example, we will do whatever we need to do to survive. But it's on you if you don't like it. So the United States, I promise you, will bend over backwards and kiss Israel's butt, begging Israel, as they do the Arabs. They beg the Arabs to take aid from them. They will tell Israel, please take, because take our conventional weapons. God forbid, because if you were ever losing a war, God forbid, stability would be an issue if Israel was to use more severe means. And the reason I say that this is important is this is something that a 13-year-old Puerto Rican kid in the Bronx understands. It's the pimp and the hooker. The pimp gives the hooker heroin. He wants her to be dependent upon him. And when she takes the heroin, she becomes dependent upon him. Israel needs to tell the United States, thanks, we'll do without. And I promise you, the United States will run to Israel and say, don't do anything rash. Here are the conventional weapons that you used to beg us for.
Right.
I've mentioned this in the many broadcasts that I've shared with you, and I think it's remiss if I didn't say it again. There is in play a quite obvious realization. It's called the myth of Jewish intelligence.
Right. Right. Do you see a distinction in that between Jews who live in Israel and Jews who live in diaspora? terms of that type of thinking?
Yeah, yeah. If you look at the stats, I've not seen any stats which have been published in the last 2 or 3 years, but they remain somewhat accurate. If you look at the stats, the figures, the surveys that were done a decade ago, and even a few years sooner, or more recently, I should say, those stats show this absolute split. In the United States, a majority of Jews fashion themselves politically to be liberal. They're liberals. I mean, and it's evidenced by the fact that in any national election in America, we have 70% of the Jews voting, a minimum of 70. I mean, I could go down and give you the last 10 elections and tell you what those numbers are. On average, 70%, 72%, 75% of Jews in America vote for the Democrats. The Democrats have proven themselves over the last couple of years, and particularly with this Biden administration, to be anti-Israel. Not just pro-Israel, anti-Israel. And what's remarkable is if you factor in the Orthodox Jewish vote, which is certainly not as large as the liberal Reform Jewish vote, the conservative Jewish vote, if you take away the American, the vote that is given by the American modern Orthodox Jew, that 74%, 75% jumps to 82, 83%. American Jews are liberal. They don't vote according to Israel issue. They vote on all other issues. They will see they'll see a big D next to the name of a candidate. It doesn't matter who that candidate is. Heinrich Himmler, Democrat. Okay, I vote. That's American Jews. Now the polls that were done in Israel at the same time showed that there was a tremendous disparity between those who label themselves liberal left in Israel and those who consider themselves nationalists to the right. Unfortunately, as we've seen in the streets the last 34 weeks, we've seen that the left has become quite vocal and at times violent, and they've taken control of the narrative, whereas in reality, the majority of Jews in Israel are nationalists. They vote right of center. There's no question about it. If we take the Arab vote in Israel and look at where Jews vote, the liberal would never have zero chance of ever coming to power unless it was done by a measure of deceit, the way that Naftali Bennett did it with Lapid. So yes, there's a huge discrepancy between the mind of the American Jew and the mind of the Jew in Israel. There's nothing going to change. The sad thing is in Israel, all those parties which are right of center, which includes both the Zionist party, the Zionist religious party, and the religious parties, they seem not to be able to get together in a coalition and literally serve as one strong bloc. There are always problems. Historically, that's been the case. And that's the reason we suffer. American Jews, by the way, and this is a subject for a different discussion, but it's one that has to be had. I know we've made reference to it on your broadcast before, is the American Jew or the Jew in the diaspora has basically, quite willingly, purposely and purposefully withdrawn from any support of Israel. They don't give a damn about Israel. And I did studies, they don't give a damn about Israel. They claim they love Israel. J Street that they love. If J Street is surveyed, members of J Street are surveyed, and they said, are you pro-Israel? They will tell you, yes, I'm decidedly pro-Israel, and that's the reason I want Israel to go back to the pre-67 borders. I'm pro-Israel, and I'm pro-peace. That's the reason I think Jerusalem and the Temple Mount should be given to the Arabs. That's their definition of being pro-Israel. If we're talking about those people who are pro-Israel in the sense that they actually believe that Israel needs to be superior to the Arabs, they aren't to be found in America today. They are a minority. And that's a reality that we've got to come to terms with. And there's a huge debate now. There's a huge debate among the rabbis or the so-called rabbis in America, in which they used to say we support Israel because, well, Israel is it sort of underscores everything that Judaism is about. Their attitude today is no. American Jewry is where it's about. We don't care about Jerusalem. It's the reality. And anyone who denies that is, to use the title that the title of the op-ed, not that I talked about it, is part of a kind of mass blindness and voluntary self-deception. That's
Right.
what it is.
You know, I've even seen in Israel with the anti-government protests going on amongst the leaders. I monitor their sites, and they actually had a discussion about whether they should be focusing their protests also on the slogan, "End the occupation." And it was voted down by the majority of them because they said if we adopt that, we're going to lose our momentum and people are going to abandon us. So, yeah, there is a total difference with Jews in Israel and the United States. Absolutely.
If you would ask a Jew, and I'm not even talking about a J Street Jew, I'm talking about an AIPAC Jew, a Jew who gives his money, loves Israel, has had several bar mitzvahs in Israel, stays at the King David Hotel, a supporter of Israel. If you ask him, what do the Arabs view as occupied? And assuming that they know anything about Israel, they'll say everything that came after is a result of Israel's victory in the 6-Day War. None of them are going to say the Arabs recognize every piece of land, every dunam that Israel occupies is considered to be occupied. The numbers are quite clear, and I mentioned this also in the op-ed piece I did. Israel proper is about 8,100, 8,200 square miles. The occupied territories from 1967 are about 2,183 square miles. Okay, never mind that the Sinai was 2.5 times the size of Israel. That's already been returned. Gaza is actually, Gaza is quite small. The Golan is quite even smaller. And when people, well, it's not smaller, but the same. They're small and consequential. The Arabs, when they talk about occupation, aren't talking about 2,183 square miles. That is the West Bank. They're not talking about the West Bank. When the Arabs talk about occupation, they're talking about 10,705 square miles. They talk about it. This isn't something that I've created or imagined. I'm quoting them, and they tell us that that is what occupation is. And they insist that the occupation be corrected. On the basis of what? On July 15th of last year, Mahmoud Abbas said it again. He said, we're ready to accept the November 29th, 1947 Resolution 181. We're ready to accept it, which means that Israel will actually be smaller than the Israel of June 4th, 1967, because that included a few additional lands which were captured in the 48-49 war.
In the 48 war, yeah.
And is there, and mind you, the Jews, we're talking about these people, the Jews who have money. These are exceptionally talented business people who sit there on the board of directors of all these Jewish organizations. We're talking about doctors, we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about, these are intelligent people who have no common sense. When you say to them, are you troubled by the fact that on Palestinian television yesterday, the Arabs came out and said that there will not be peace in the Middle East until Palestine is established from the river to the sea, and you turn to this person who graduated from Ivy League school and say, are you troubled by that comment? What that they're not. And the reason they're not is because they and their children live in the ivory towers of Boston. That's where they It's not their children who have to sleep in bomb shelters when missiles come raining in on Israel. And there comes a point where we just have to recognize it. The answer is, I've done this before. I won't. Well, here, I'm going to do one more. I'm looking at the clock. I apologize. I have to go. As you know, I have a
I know.
previous engagement. I just want to read this. It's a beautiful piece. It was written in 1923. I'm not sure what it is in Canada, but in America, in the United States, 1923 is 100 years ago. Okay, anyhow, it was written by Jabotinsky. It was written by Jabotinsky. It's part of the Iron Wall, and we've before. But this is 100 years ago. And he's addressing the so-called moderates, the people that I'm speaking about. Here's what he said. I can now get to the point that the heirs of the land of Israel should willingly come to an agreement with us is beyond all hopes and dreams at present and in the foreseeable future. This inner conviction of mine I express so categorically, not because of any wish to dismay the moderate faction of the Zionist camp, but on the contrary, because I wish to save them from such dismay. Apart from those who have been virtually blind since childhood, all of the moderate Zionists have long since understood that there's not even the slightest hope of ever obtaining an agreement of the heirs of the land of Israel to Palestine becoming a country with a Jewish majority. Jabotinsky recognized this in 1923. In all our brilliance, with all the wars that have been launched against Israel, with terrorism that took a Jewish life only this morning, all the brilliant people we have in think tanks and what have you, we still don't seem to be able to understand what Jabotinsky understood then. It's terrible.
Absolutely.
It's terrible. Anyhow,
Mayor, I know you have something to get to in about 2 minutes.
yeah,
Listen, thank you very much. We'll have you on again. We have to get the word out because that's how we have to defeat the lies from the left and from especially from the Jewish liberal left in diaspora. But we got to get the word out, and we're doing the best to get our word out of what the truth is. That, as Rabbi Kahana said, not 1 inch.
allow me one more sentence, Mayor, and I thank you for the time. In a future discussion between like-minded souls, I think it's important that we discuss exactly what the two-state solution is, because if you ask the average person who is pro-Israel, do you support the two-state solution? They live this illusion, two-state solution. By its very name, it's a solution. Why wouldn't I support it? I think we need to put it in perspective, because if people understood the elements that are required in order to establish a two-state solution, they might think otherwise. But once again, thank you very much for the time.
Absolutely. We'll do that. Thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Well, thank you very much. And everyone who watched it now live or watch it on our YouTube channel as we're going to be sending it out, please share this on whatever platform you use, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email lists. We'll reach a lot more people. We'll have a stronger impact. Thank you very much. Shalom, shalom.